has anybody ever here been convinced of something? I mean, persuaded by something. Can't nobody tell you different. You've been completely convinced of something only to find out that you're wrong. Anybody ever experienced that? I recently, last week, in fact, I took my wife and my daughter, Selah, and Pastor Lisa. I took them to Paris Baguette. You remember that, Selah? I took them to Paris Baguette, but here was the problem. As I was approaching Paris Baguette, I'm driving, and Lisa sees Paris Baguette, and she gets all excited. She's like, oh my God, Paris Baguette. And in my mind, I'm saying this to myself. I'm like, why is she so excited? Like I've been here with her before. Like I've taken her to Paris Baguette. Why is she so excited? But the problem is I said that out loud. And I was like, honey, why are you so excited? I've taken you to Paris Baguette. And her response was like, excuse me? You've taken who? Where? And I was like, no, baby, you don't remember that we went to Paris Baguette, we got the coffee and we got the almond croissant. You don't remember that? She's like, I don't know who you took. And I don't know where you took them. But as for me, you have never in your life taken me to Paris Baguette. So I was living in a whole Paris Baguette false reality. Come on, somebody. It turns out I've never taken Lisa to Paris Baguette. And I know some of you are wondering who it is that I took to Paris Baguette. And to that I say, mind your business. You have to come next week to find out. But on the same day, I can't believe this happened on the same day. She comes into the car now. Watch this. She comes into the car and she finds a eyeliner. And now we have just entered a whole episode of CSI. Because she comes up to me and she goes, who does this eyeliner belong to? And I, like the great wise husband that I am, I said, I don't even know what an eyeliner is. What is that you hold in your hand? She said, no. Who's this belong to? And I'm like, honey, I don't know who this eyeliner belongs to. Selah, is this yours? To which Selah, her little Lisa minion, goes, I don't know, but it's not mine. So Dad, who's the chick this eyeliner belongs to? And I'm like, Lord, come through right now because the enemy has turned my wife and my daughter against me. Come on. And she quickly, in a few moments, realized that the eyeliner belonged to a friend that she gave a ride to. And I'm like, you're going to go call that friend up and tell them they just almost cost me my life. Call them up right now. But here's what I realized about both scenarios. And you might be wondering, what is it that Pastor Rowe is getting at when it comes to this story? And it really has nothing to do with my message. I'm just asking for help, guys. We need help. But the reality is that what I realized about both scenarios is that both scenarios, her and I were living, even for a moment, we were living in this kind of false reality. We were living in this kind of false notion, and it took a greater truth to expel the lie that we were living in, even if it was for a moment. Now, I thank God that for a moment only, we were living in this false reality. Like, I was convinced, y'all. When I'm telling you, like, I had the memory and everything, I was absolutely convinced that I took Lisa to Paris Baguette. Like, I saw us eating with an almond croissant, except that I was wrong. She was convinced of God knows what. We're going to keep that. I don't even know. But it took a greater truth to expose and expel the lie, even for a moment that she was living in, even for those few seconds. Now, imagine this. We were lucky enough to live in that false reality only for a few seconds, but can you imagine not living in a false reality for a few seconds? Can you imagine living in the false reality for a few seasons? Not just living in a false reality for a moment, but you're living in this false reality, not for a limited time, but you're living in this false reality for a lifetime. Listen, by the time we are introduced to this man named Truman, he is living not in a moment that's been fabricated or conditioned or this moment that is a lie. He's living in a world that is fake. He's living in a world that it is a complete false reality. Every interaction, every person that he comes into contact with, it is a false reality. And this is the person that he's living in this place from the moment he was born. And it's not for a second, it's not for a moment, it's his entire life. Now, the thing is that Lisa and I had a truth that was able to expose and expel the lie. But what happens when you don't have access to the truth? See, what happens when you've been born into the lie? What happens when you were raised that way? What happens when the life that is fabricated and the life that is a false reality is what you call normal? See, Truman did what we would have all done if we had not had the truth. We don't question it, we call it normal. We don't deny it, we adapt to it. We don't cancel it, we don't say it's not true, we just live and build our life and our future on this false reality. Why? Because we didn't have an exposure to the truth. And the truth is that sometimes this false reality that we live in, sometimes it comes in different shapes and sizes. Sometimes it comes in different experiences. Sometimes it comes in this notion that you thought that you took your wife to Paris Baguette when you didn't. It comes in all different sizes, but maybe sometimes it sounds something like this. Maybe it sounds something like, this is who I am and I'm never gonna change. False reality. What if it sounded something like, I'm not easy to love? False reality. What if it sounds something like, well, vulnerability is weakness, therefore I will never be vulnerable to a man? False reality. I can live my life any way I want and nothing's gonna happen to me. False reality. See, what happens is though, because it feels real, because it feels authentic, because it's all we know, we live our life and build our future on it. And this was the direction of Truman. He was living his life, he was building his life on this false reality, and he had no clue. Because how many of you know that if you had a clue, you would expose it? How many of you know that if you know a greater truth, you would expose the lie? But if you don't know the greater truth, the reality that you're living in, though it may be false, you accept it as your life. I love this quote that comes towards the end of the movie. It's by Christoph, who's the antagonist of the movie. And it says this, watch this, so powerful. When he said it, man, I wrote it down. I was like, hold on a second, let me write this down. He says, we accept the reality of the world with which we are presented. And my friends, as true as it is for the physical, it is so with the spiritual. We accept the reality of the world which we are presented. And so Paul writes to the people in Rome. He's writing this letter to the people, to the churches. And he writes this and he starts this letter by saying, shall we continue to sin so that grace will abound all the more? By the way, if you are preaching the unadulterated grace of God, this question must come up. Because when you share the message of God's grace to the degree that the Apostle Paul did, you're always going to have to face this question. Because when you share the grace of God the way Paul did, matter of fact, if this question is not coming up to your people, guess what? You're not preaching the unadulterated grace of God. Because for Paul, he had to address it about 4 or 5 times. Come on, somebody. And if Paul had to address it 4 or 5 times, that means that if we're not having to address this question, we may not be preaching the grace of God to the extent that the Apostle Paul was preaching it. So Paul's like, hey, should we continue to sin so that grace will abound all the more? He's like, of course not. He's like, why would we continue to live in something that we have already put to death? He says, shall we continue to sin so that grace will abound all the more? He's like, no, sin is the narrator of your old story. Sin is the producer that was puppeteering everything in your life before you met Jesus. He says, shall we continue to live in that? And look what he says in verse 3. He says, don't you know? I like the way that sounds. It says, don't you know that all of us who were baptized in Christ, we were baptized into his death? Now we kind of hear that and be like, Pastor O, that sounds really spiritually good, but what does that mean? What he's saying that when Jesus Christ died on the cross, it was not the only thing that died. He says, when you were baptized, something happened. Paul says, don't you realize that when you were baptized, when you were submerged under the waters, something took place? Don't you realize that when you went under the waters, something more than you getting wet took place? Don't you realize when you were placed under the waters, don't you realize something happened? You weren't just following a religious tradition. When you were baptized, you were giving a funeral to the false reality that up until this point you thought was true. He goes, don't you realize that when you were submerged under the waters, you were laying to rest the person you thought you were? Don't you realize that when you were submerged under the waters, you weren't following a church rule? You were drowning the lies and the labels and the sin that was trying to destroy your life. Don't you realize that when you were baptized, you weren't just following a ritual. You were becoming a rebel to the sin and the devil and all the principalities that were trying to take your life. Don't you realize that when you were baptized, you weren't just going inside of a tub. You were serving notice to the enemy that you refuse to live the old life that you once lived. I wonder if there's anybody in this place that says, hey, I'm dead to the old and I'm alive to the new.